Hello and welcome. This is now video 4 of a brief survey through the book of Ruth, using an emphasis on social cultural dynamics. This is the second video of for chapter 2. I covered most of what I wanted to cover in the first video of for this chapter. However, as I continue to engage the text, I realize there may have been a couple of things that I left unsaid, or one or two other things that I wanted to highlight just a little bit more. Dr. Ron Allen of Dallas Theological Seminary calls this the finest short story in all of ancient literature, and it very well may be. As chapter 1 transitions into chapter 2, it's the time of the harvest. There's a lot of hope, but also a lot of fear, much disappointment, and pessimism surrounding a harvest. And here they're just coming out of famine, which means people are still living on rations. The reserves have not been restored yet by any means. Ruth is here, and she is an outsider who wants a share in their food. And you might imagine how resistant they would be to an outsider who wants some of what they have when what they have has not been enough. Painting a picture of my contemporary world in the United States, there's some with a political outcry of why the nation would give benefits to immigrants, and not to take a political side and all of that. However, that's kind of the temperament and sentiment that would have existed during Ruth's time, except probably much more intensely, because these are people who had been starving. So Ruth goes out into the field. We might call the time around first light as 6 a.m. And in that part of the world, it can be very comfortable, in fact, even cool during that time. However, 2 hours later, by 8 a.m., it would be much less comfortable, even a little uncomfortable. By 10 o'clock, it is very uncomfortable. And here is Ruth. Likely she's wearing wool, because that's what the Jewish women would have worn, and she has gone into covenant with Naomi to become Jewish in a cultural sense. And her wool is possibly even black, the widows wear. And so how much water can she carry with her to last her in this field all day? Probably not enough. But of course, Boaz is going to come. It's going to be reinforced 3 times that he's warning his men to leave her alone. That literary aspect of the 3 warnings is not insignificant, and I delved a little more into the significance of that in the prior video. He's going to recognize that Ruth is going to be very thirsty, and in fact likely going to suffer from dehydration while in his fields. During that time, they didn't have water. They didn't have any bodies of water flowing near Bethlehem, and so they had cisterns that caught the rainwater, and donkeys would carry large jars on each side out into the field. And here, Boaz is going to give Ruth to drink. He calls her daughter, and we can relate and understand, because there's a fundamental need of humanity to have connection. However, in my culture, there's a virtue of rugged individualism and of independence. But in the culture of the biblical text, they're very collectivistic and very community-oriented. You had to fit in somewhere. You cannot be alone without community. And that's an important aspect as Boaz brings her into his community. Although she's at the very bottom, she's still maybe even off the social scale still, as she recognizes that she's below even his slave girls, but yet she's somewhere, and he has offered her his protection. That is very significant. He's going to allow her to come and eat with them. This also is very significant. it says that she ate all that she wanted, and she still had left over. These statements are very important because someone who has been through starvation may not have eaten all they wanted, but still tried to keep leftovers anyway and still was hungry. However, the fact that she ate all she wanted, which would have been extremely rare in the course of her life, and she still had some left over, which was equally as rare. There wasn't a concept of leftovers. She had enough to bring to her mother-in-law, which also speaks to her dedication and loyalty to Naomi. These are very, very significant. Boaz gives her a seat at his table. That's a great part of our Christian witness and testimony. When Jesus comes on the scene, more in Luke than in anywhere else, Jesus is known for opening up his table and inviting the social misfits to come and eat with him, both in a very literal fashion, such as with the tax collectors and sinners, as well as with Zacchaeus, but also in a spiritual sense, in a parabolic sense, as we find in some of the parables in the middle part of the Gospel of Luke. And so, Boaz, he's someone who certainly is conscientious of the Jewish law to leave behind some of this grain for the foreigner and widow. But he's not only conscientious of the written law, but he's conscientious about human good. He's someone who realizes the grain does not belong to him, nor does the land. The water does not belong to him, neither does the donkey, but rather he is a steward in God's world. And what Boaz has done is something that is going to last for a long time, and even into eternity. We'll see some of the immediate effects in the following chapters of what Boaz does and has done. And we can even see it here and now, because perhaps as much as 3 millennia later, we are sitting here, wherever we are around the world, and taking our time to consider the thoughts, actions, words, and deeds of Boaz in a very unique part of the world in a very different time, so long ago. All right, I will see you again at video number 3, which ought to be posted sometime early the week of December 6th.